throughout this entire process of Joe Manchin and a handful of other corporate Democrats absolutely eviscerating Joe Biden's Build Back Better Act, we have been told over and over and over again, both by Joe Manchin and the corporate media outlets, that he is just this good old West Virginia Democrat, right? He's representing a conservative state that Donald Trump overwhelmingly won both in 2020 and 2016. So his hands are tied. He has absolutely no choice because he's just doing his best to represent his constituents that just so happen to be more conservative than what Build Back Better would have allowed for. So I've told you guys a million different ways how entirely bullshit that narrative is, and how Joe Manchin essentially is just a corrupt millionaire coal baron who doesn't represent virtually anybody in West Virginia other than maybe, you know, the top 1% that funnel money into his campaign coffers. So just to put this in full perspective, how detached from reality this narrative actually is and how disingenuous Joe Manchin is being by trying to pretend to represent, average West Virginia constituents, let's just go ahead and check in with some absolutely fantastic on-the-ground reporting yet again from More Perfect Union, who I will link down in the description below this entire video. But they basically went out and actually talked to like the single most stereotypical, picturesque example of who Joe Manchin is pretending to represent, and just asked them what they thought about his actions related to Build Back Better. So let's just go ahead and hear directly from the actual coal miners who are represented by this United Mine Workers Union on exactly what they think about Joe Manchin right now.
Coal miners, we're all coal miners, we loved it, but the future is unpredictable with that. 3 or 4 good years, but the future is the BBB.
There's language in that Build Back Better that would provide tax incentives or what have you to manufacturers that would bring in and locate factories into the coal fields, and laid off coal miners would be given a priority with regards to work opportunities,
This is a no on this legislation.
The coal industry is not going to support the coal field communities. I hate saying it, worse than the coal miners like hearing it, but it's the truth. We need to take this time to try and diversify our area and bring in additional jobs and not be so dependent on the coal mining jobs, because they're not going to last forever.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and cut off this video here. Again, I'll link the entire video down in the description if you want to go watch the rest of it. They start to touch on some of the corruption that Joe Manchin has been putting on full display for everybody to see. He's been pretty brazen with his corruption and his ties to the fossil fuel industry, which pretty much explains his actions on Build Back Better more than anything else. But we're going to get into a lot of that corruption. But at the most fundamental level, even just from that clip here, okay, you see the difference between what it means to represent like the coal industry, meaning the coal companies and the corporations and the executives that run these corporations, versus what it would mean to actually represent the workers who work at these coal mines and the coal fields, as they were just talking about here. So you see from their own perspective that these workers are not delusional, right? They understand that whether or not you like it, that fossil fuels are on their way out, that the coal industry is a dying industry. And so what they're asking for here is not to pretend to prop up this dying industry and pretend as if you can save it, but what they're asking for is a transition that actually supports them and their families, okay? And listen, if you go to a state like West Virginia that has deep historical ties to like things like the mining industry, etc., it's not that these workers and their families love coal mining inherently or love fossil fuels inherently or anything like that. They love being able to have a sustainable job where they can feed their families, put food on the table, and have some degree of economic security. And so they are realizing that right now the current economic situation, the political situation, the environmental situation is demanding that they move away from the fossil fuel industry, specifically from the coal industry in West Virginia. And they're literally just saying, if you don't take action by supporting things like Build Back Better and supporting things like aggressively transitioning towards renewable energies and creating millions of jobs along the way, if you don't head in that direction, you're just going to be leaving these towns and leaving these families and leaving these workers behind. So again, massive difference difference between representing the coal corporations that Joe Manchin himself heavily profits from, which we're about to get to here, versus representing the actual workers themselves. There's a direct contradiction here between what the union that represents these mine workers wants versus what the corporations want. The corporations want to continue to protect this industry as much as possible by funneling money into the campaign coffers of guys like Joe Manchin. They want to protect this industry, subsidize this industry, and extract as much surplus value from their mine workers as they possibly can until they can run out the back door and then leave all of these workers to the dustbin of history. Okay, so that's the reality. These coal companies and Joe Manchin, who represents those coal companies, he does not give a single solitary shit about the actual workers. If he did, then maybe he would be listening to them and actually fighting for Build Back Better instead of trying to eviscerate all of the good policies that were within this bill that are desperately needed, especially in a state like West Virginia that is one of the poorest states in the entire country. So again, we're going to touch on a little bit of the corruption here that Joe Manchin has been putting on full display for everybody to see, but just a little breakdown here from MSNBC to give you a perspective in terms of how absolutely ridiculous his corruption actually is and the depths to which this, gives us an insight into the entire U.S. political system here. But they say Joe Manchin's coal ties are worse than we thought and yet are legal. The lone Democratic holdout on Build Back Better has an astonishing conflict of interest. So again, this is coming from MSNBC, but even, they can recognize this. They say, it's been known for some time that Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia, hails from a coal country and benefits from a family business in the coal industry. But a new report from the Washington Post has revealed that Manchin's ties to the industry are greater and more direct than previously known. And they show that he knows he received about $500,000 in 2020 in returns from his investments in the business, despite his claims that he has a blind trust that keeps him in the dark regarding his assets. Okay, first of all, $500,000 in just 2020. So that's almost like double what he is making as a senator. Okay, and you mean to tell me that this is not just a glaring corrupt conflict of interest right here? He's making more from the fucking fossil fuel industry than he is as a representative. Okay, you can't possibly tell me that this is a functioning democracy. This is a guy who not only is taking bribes from corporations within the fossil fuel industry, but is also directly financially benefiting from not taking action on climate change. And not only that, but this guy also sits directly on the committees within the Senate that handle climate policy. So he's actually writing the legislation for climate policy as he is directly profiting from blocking that climate policy. I mean, it's just at face value, it's so absurdly corrupt that if this was happening in any other country, people would be able to recognize it as the absurdity that it is. But because we live here and because, Americans have become so desensitized to this brazen corruption, basically, that basically people just think that this is normal. People think that this is just how a political system works, but it shouldn't be if you actually want to have anything close to a representative democracy. So they continue here saying, what's worse, however, is than Manchin's dodge is that what he's doing is perfectly legal. Again, this is just baked into how our political system functions. They say, due to Congress's lax code of ethics regarding lawmakers' investments, Manchin's conflict of interest is permissible and in many cases completely routine. And in other words, what may have been even more scandalous than Manchin's conflict of interest is the fact that it's allowed. And again, he's not alone in this corruption. This is just, we're specifically talking about the coal industry and the fossil fuel industry. This goes for everything else. I mean, it goes for weapons manufacturing companies that bribe people who are on the Senate, intel committees and the Senate committees that are responsible for creating the military budgets. Okay, so you can go in every different industry, the healthcare industry, these massive insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies that bribe politicians to oppose things like Medicare for all. You can go sector by sector. Joe Manchin is not alone in this, okay? Again, it's baked into the entire U.S. political system, but they continue saying Manchin has a lucrative family business that sells waste coal to a power plant in West Virginia that emits air pollution at a higher rate than any other plant in the state. So he literally is profiting from, one of the worst polluting plants in the entire state that he is representing here. But they continue saying under the former clean electricity provision in Build Back Better, that business could have been hurt by that. So Joe Manchin's own financial interest could have been hurt by that. And they say Manchin played a decisive role in killing that provision, despite explanations from policymakers and experts that it would have lowered energy costs and created thousands of jobs in his state. So again, just to recap, as they say here, it's not just legal for Manchin to vote directly on policies that he has a direct financial interest in. He's actually expected to do it unless he meets a very high threshold for exemption because of all the congressional guidance on lawmakers attending all legislative matters before the body. And for this reason, he can chair the Senate Energy Energy and Natural Resources Committee and single-handedly torpedo climate policies desperately needed to help save the planet, all while raking in cash from the coal industry. So again, just a synopsis, he's fucking corrupt. I mean, it doesn't get more, complicated than that. That's just what's happening, right? He's taking bribes from this industry, he's directly financially profiting from this industry, and then he is sitting on the goddamn committee that writes climate legislation. It's a complete joke. And so you see why, even West Virginia coal miners are able to see through this bullshit. They understand that he doesn't represent them. He represents the industry. He represents the corporation, the capital owners who are profiting from this entire process and who, at the end of the day, again, will kick these workers to the curb when the coal industry inevitably dies, and they will leave them with no other potential avenues because you aren't going to be deploying a lot of those policies that they were asking for in this video, right? You heard the workers bring up like a transition policy, right? And future, job training programs. But just to give you more of a cohesive perspective in terms of what could actually be done to help these workers transition away from the coal industry and towards more like renewable energies, let's just go back and look at parts of the Green New Deal that were included in Bernie Sanders' platform, because I think it's a completely uncontroversial statement that is verifiably true that a guy like Bernie Sanders, who would be portrayed by Joe Manchin as a radical, socialist basically, that a guy like Bernie Sanders actually represents West Virginia coal miners significantly more than a guy like Joe Manchin does. So here was his policy on a transition for workers. He says, "This plan will prioritize the fossil fuel workers who have powered our economy for more than a century and who have too often been neglected by corporations and politicians. We will guarantee 5 years of a worker's current salary, housing assistance, job training, health care, pension support, and priority job placement for any displaced worker, as well as early retirement support for those who choose it or who can no longer work." So this is what it looks like to actually give a shit about West Virginia coal miners, or to actually give a shit about average people in West Virginia that could have benefited not only from a transition away from the fossil fuel industry for these specific coal miners, but also just everybody in the state of West Virginia, which again is one of the poorest, most struggling states in the entire country. And I brought up this poll a million different times, but it really is just amazing when you go provision by provision and see how just thoroughly of a bullshit artist that Joe Manchin is to pretend like he represents these voters. Okay, again, this is a poll of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Okay, this is not just Democrats. And if you go policy by policy, everything that was included in the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better Act is overwhelmingly supported by Joe Manchin's constituents, including even the ones that are, less so of a net support down here with clean energy investments. Okay, even the clean energy investments, which has less support than all of these other policies, even that has a super majority support with a net 28, a plus 28 net support, and 60% of West Virginia constituents supporting it. So again, the lesson here is, even in a state like West Virginia that is typically, stereotypically known as a conservative state, right? Maybe they're much more conservative on social issues, on things like gun rights and abortion and shit like that. But when you actually look at like basic policies surrounding economics, surrounding healthcare, surrounding materially improving the lives of average Americans, they overwhelmingly support it. So again, this is why you have to have some sort of a left-wing economic populist approach to the politics of all of this. And this is the window that Joe Biden has completely ignored and completely whiffed on throughout this entire process, is he thinks that Joe Manchin actually represents these people. He doesn't represent these people. He represents corporations. He represents corporate America, just like half of the other Democratic establishment does as well, including really Joe Biden himself. But when you get into the policies, this is where the leverage was. This is why Joe Biden could have gone to West Virginia and actually rallied alongside those coal miners, okay? Imagine the optics of that if Joe Biden had gone to West Virginia, done a rally, stood out there with these coal miners and said, "Joe Manchin, you're full of fucking shit, okay? You're full of shit. You don't represent these people. They are standing here alongside me fighting for the entirety of Build Back Better." I mean, that alone could have put a tidal wave of pressure on Joe Manchin to force him to fall in line. But instead, Joe Biden kicks up his feet and says, what can be done about it? Okay, Joe Manchin, he is who he is. So again, at the end of the day, the lesson here is that Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, the rest of these corporate ghouls who eviscerated and basically killed Build Back Better, they are full of absolute shit. They do not represent their constituents. They represent the corporations and their own financial interests that are, skewing their perspective on all of these legislative matters. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's really just more of a lesson in terms of the missed political opportunity for Joe Joe Biden and for Democrats in a more general sense to actually get this passed. They very easily could have done it if they were willing to apply minimal pressure on Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema. But again, this is why you need somebody who actually is more of like an LBJ or FDR style, break your knees type of president, instead of somebody who is already half asleep or half dead or whatever the fuck Joe Biden is right now, okay? It's just been absolutely pathetic, and you can see that even West Virginia coal miners, the stereotypical example of who Joe Manchin pretends to represent, even they are not buying his bullshit.